And all right, here we go. Thanks everybody for joining us today. This is the next UX Spotlight brought to you by Corporate Insight User Experience Department. You may be wondering what exactly is a UX Spotlight. This is a thing that we started doing recently. If you're not familiar with our monitor services, that's at Corporate Insight, one of our core businesses where we monitor within the financial services and healthcare industry pretty much everybody. We're looking at your competitors, we're looking at you, we're seeing who's doing what in the digital space behind the login. So we get access behind the login to live accounts where we're able to see what people are doing, and we do a syndicated report so that we're creating a level playing field. Everybody is able to see what the industry standards are. And, we don't just report on what they're doing, but we also talk about who does it better, who's got strengths, who's got weaknesses, what they are, so that everybody can improve their digital online experience. Obviously, a great way to supplement that is with user testing, getting these interfaces in front of actual users. In order to prove that, and a few years ago, I came on board to build out a dedicated user experience research department. And we do user experience research for our clients, but we also do it for ourselves. So we'll do some UX research to see who's doing what, see which is better, if there are areas for improvement. And a little while ago, we decided, hey, if we're doing this research, why don't we make it available to our clients? Certainly it does feed into those monitors. If you're a monitor subscriber, you can benefit from that information, but why don't we do like we do for our clients and actually do a readout of the findings? That brings us to where we are today, the UX Spotlight series. So we do these across the different verticals that we work in. And today it is time for retirement, the retirement plan monitor. So without any further ado, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and why you're listening to me. My name is Adam Holnick. I run the User Experience Research Department here at Corporate Insight. I've been doing UX work for over 20 years at this point, and I've been at Corporate Insight for about 3 years. I'm joined today with Madeline Jordan on my team. She is a UX research specialist. And she performed the research that we're going to be taking a look at today. So we're going to take you through our findings in a minute. Just want to let you know our intention here is not to shame anybody. Certainly there are people who did better and there are people who did worse. When we show examples, the intention is not to make anybody feel bad, not to shine a spotlight on who's doing things badly. It's really a matter of for us all to be able to learn what works and what does not. At the end, we're going to do a Q&A. The Q&As are always spirited. It's your opportunity to ask about the slides that we're about to see, but also to ask about anything in the UX world, really. We often get questions about methodology or approach, and that is certainly fair as well. So let's dive right in. So today we're going to be looking at retirement investment transactions. This is for plan participants. Just a little quick methodology. I know it's always boring to start with the techie stuff, but at the same time, I think it's important to get some context about how we got this data. We did an in-person user test. We did in-depth one-on-one interviews with 7 respondents. Did it here in New York City. We got pretty diverse group, but we did look for people in the 30 to 52 range, just because the concern was if we went too young, people wouldn't really be thinking too much about retirement. And we showed them live websites of CUNA Mutual, John Hancock Principal, and Voya Financial. So diving right in, difficulties with language and jargon. This is something that we see pretty often with financial services and with healthcare sites. The reality is that your customers do not speak the same language that you do. We saw a lot of the information, a lot of the calls to action, the links on the websites were in financial speak, and this created confusion for the users. They would see this, they weren't be sure, what something would mean. It might be a term that they weren't sure about. There might be a couple of terms that seemed like they might be too similar. All of this was exacerbated by the fact that, as we know, when it comes to the transactions that you can make for your retirement site for a plan participant, they can be kind of nuanced. Are you making a change to the funds that you already have invested, to the investment of the funds that you are adding? All of this created kind of a difficult situation. And what people ended up doing is they would I'd try one. No, I don't think that's what I want. Hit the back button, try the next one. I don't think that's what I want. Hit the back button, try again. Obviously, this is not a great user experience to be, sort of trial and error picking a winner. So the language was a big issue. What we recommend is plain English descriptions of what you're looking for. Now, none of the ones that we looked at actually did do a good job of this. The closest that we got here was with John Hancock, where they used bubble text, and the bubble text actually spoke to, in real English language, human terms, what people were trying to do, what they were going to get out of something, so that at least somebody could read that and say, oh, okay, I know what that link is going to be. But again, this was not the initial language that they saw. They would have to hover or click the help icon in order to get that help text. So we're going to do a few little quizzes here. If you've been to one of these before, you'll know that we like to do little polls as we go. So we popped up a little poll here. The first poll, which, if any of the following people ask you what industry-specific words mean when you're talking about work? This happens to me. I'll sometimes be, talking to somebody at a party, and I'll throw out some user-centered design-based language, and people will be like, what? So just curious if any of you find yourself talking to somebody about work and you hit them with some language that they don't understand. All right, and as the answers are rolling in, it looks like so far parents and friends are the big winners. Parents, not surprising. My mom has no idea what I do. I am seeing a few of the coworkers, and I don't know if folks are being facetious. It's also entirely possible that within a single organization, there might be a few different lexicons that are being used. So, all right, looks like most of you have had a chance to answer, so we will go ahead and close the poll and continue with the presentation. Thank you for taking the poll with us, though. I think that helps drive home the fact that if your friends who know you and know what you do can't understand what you're talking about when you talk about work, there's a good chance that your plan participants can't either. All right, the next thing that we saw that was a big theme, information overload. So again, people would, they get to the site, they want to be able to have something to kind of ground them in terms of, here's what a fund is. Do I want to put my investments into this? Just kind of a high-level overview. I would say probably you'd want to look to search engines and e-commerce as the good standard bearers for something like this. Because you think about it, you go to something, you want to be able to see that you have options. You want to see really what the difference of the options is so that you've got that initial information sent to help you determine, is this worth investigating further? just a little bit of a taste to give somebody an idea, do I want to explore further? And then when somebody thinks that they have a fund of interest and they want to explore further, then at that point, giving them a way to click in and dig in more. We did see people, by the way, they liked a new window or a new tab. This, while it didn't specifically come up in this user test, we have heard in user testing in the past that sometimes there's a little bit of fear of clicking on something because you don't know what that back button is going to do for you. Think about if you've ever gone to a shopping site and you put in your search criteria and you filter on your size and you filter on your color and your favorite material, and you click on something and you click the back button and it takes you back to square one, right? That could be driving some of this preference for a new window or a new tab. But again, the ability to click in and get more information one click away. The other area, hey, listen, if somebody's plan offers a lot of options, that's a good thing, right? More choice is always good. But kind of like when you come into a restaurant and you've got, 6-page menu, and that's just for the beer list, and you don't even know where to start, you don't want to overwhelm people with the amount of options that they have. So, when you're designing your sites, there will be plans that only have a few options, but there will probably be plenty of plans where they have a lot of different options, and you need to design for that as well. So what we found worked for the CUNA Mutual, for example, where they had them grouped by asset class. You're able to click on that to expand it to see what's within that. You're able to then collapse it so that you can just see the category, see the percentage. That was a great way of handling a longer list. All right, now we'll talk about some of the UX of some of the key features.
So Adam mentioned the balloon tips earlier that John Hancock used to really convey the meaning behind the transaction options. And we also noticed that, like Adam said, that they relied heavily on this, but to a point of it being almost over-reliance on these balloon tips. There were so many balloon tips throughout the site, and at a certain point, if you're using balloon tips for most items on the page, there may be a need to kind of rethink how you're presenting that information to your users. We also found that respondents were a bit frustrated with balloon tips that had a lot of information in them. So we have two examples here at the bottom. In the left, we have an example of a balloon tip that respondents really liked. It was quick and simple, and they really easily picked up on what was being told to them. Whereas in the right example here, there was bullet points, which did help it a bit in being able to skim, but just the fact that there was so much information that bullet points were necessary, that was the key to respondents, that it was a large amount of text for them to read, and they were a bit overwhelmed by that.
So, this is another thing that we hear a lot. The ability when you get to the end of a journey, a selection process, to be able to review and confirm. In fact, we hear this so often in so many different areas that we could point to examples very recently of other client work that we've done where we hear this data. The idea is you make a bunch of selections, you make a bunch of changes, and you hit submit, and then you're done, right? Well, that can be a little bit scary. If somebody's, not quite sure, they get to the end. I've worked with clients before where they've wanted to user test. Well, we want to shorten the process. So, hey, we can get rid of a whole click here. And we put it in front of users and they're like, whoa, it's done. I didn't get a chance to check my work. So that's something that can really make users nervous, especially when it comes to something like their finances, where making a mistake could potentially have unknown consequences on their actual retirement savings.
And specifically, with a few of the sites that we looked at, to begin, we had respondents complete a task to make changes to their new money that's coming in. And at the end of that process, a few of the sites asked, hey, do you also want to make this same change to your existing money that's already in your portfolio? This is a completely different question, and it's completely changing your current investments. And a lot of times people interpreted that question to actually be a confirmation because there is so much expectation for that confirmation, as Adam mentioned. So this was a pretty big red flag that we are possibly having respondents and users make a completely different action that they aren't aware of.
Great. So another little quiz for us here. Okay. Yeah, that's live now. So if you want to take the little quiz, just curious, thinking about those confirmations at the end, what types of transactions would you be comfortable doing, hitting the done button without seeing check your selections before you go? So yeah, the options here, paying a credit card bill, ordering an ebook, buying a plane ticket, changing your entire retirement portfolio, or ordering a meal for pickup. We'll give folks a moment there to go ahead and vote. But yeah, this is something that we see all the time, that extra little piece of friction to keep people from going too far down a wrong path. As long as we're waiting for people to vote, I'm actually going to back up a slide here. Just because I think this is so important, this realign investment. Here somebody thinks they're coming to the end. It's like, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure, when in fact you're actually going down a whole new path. So, that from a user experience perspective, it could at a minimum be annoying, or at worst could have somebody taking an unintended action.
And Principal actually had a really good fix for this. They just clearly labeled in the image on the right here, they clearly labeled additional options before having them answer the question, just so straight from the beginning it was clear that you'd be doing something completely different.
So most of you have finished the poll. I'll go ahead and close that. But yeah, it looks like most of you are not comfortable doing any of these without a confirmation. Ordering an ebook slightly beats out ordering a meal for pickup, not even for delivery. And if you're not even comfortable ordering a sandwich without a confirmation, think about how users would feel, realigning their portfolio without that. So thanks everybody for taking that quiz with us. Another thing, and this is something that we hear in different ways across different industries, people don't like to do math. I probably could have predicted that one, but the way that works out in a few areas is, with this, if you're having to choose things that are going to add up to 100%, if there's not a big counter there that's keeping track of how far you are to done choosing your options, that puts the onus on the users to have to do the math in their heads. And I can tell you from a lot of experience of testing users, they do not like to do math in their heads. Now, I tell you, I had thought that users would be more interested in seeing the amount remaining rather than the amount building. I love being wrong, and it turns out that there was not a strong preference. Should it be counting up or counting down? Turns out counting to 100 is actually pretty common in our society, so people are able to do the math. If there's 95 selected, there's 5% remaining. But yeah, keeping that tally for people so that they don't have to keep track, that was a big thing for people.
We were also not all that surprised to hear that respondents wanted more visualizations. It's something we hear often, but a few sites did a good job with it. Principal, for example, in this first example that we have on the left top hand corner, they used icons and color and tiles to make the pages feel lighter, and it actually assisted in comprehension as well. And John Hancock, in the example below, the site lacked the imagery for the most part. Several respondents said they really still wanted the positivity, but it felt a bit dull, and that images, icons could make the site have more life. As for pie charts, sometimes we hear that graphs and pie charts are a bit confusing and overwhelming for respondents, but with this group in particular, that wasn't necessarily the case. This may be because they're used to managing their own investments, and that's something that is actually helpful in this situation. But there is such a thing as too many pie charts. John Hancock, for example, they had a page that showed like 6 to 7 pie charts at a time. It was a bit difficult for respondents to really understand what the difference between these 6 different pie charts were. But Principal, they had a fix for this, that they had 3 different pie charts that they wanted to show in the same area of the site. And they used tabs so that respondents could toggle in between the 3. So only one pie chart would be shown at a time. And they were also clearly labeled, which made it clear to respondents what they were looking at.
You know, if you've ever been to one of my trainings about UX, you've maybe heard me rail against icons. And I think it's important to make the distinction. It's important to make the distinction that, you know, with icons like this, now this is relatively arbitrary, but this icon isn't living here on its own. This icon is there to support the text around it, which is relatively clear. It spells things out. Something like this makes the page a little bit more friendly. It lightens it up a little bit. Instead of just being a block of text, it's text and images. It has a psychological, emotional impact on people that generally is pretty positive. If this icon were just sitting there on its own, then yeah, there's a good chance that people would be confused by it. But I wanted to throw that out there because I know I've given talks before where I talk about how icons can be so problematic. They're not a problem unless they're doing too much of the heavy lifting. So in this case, the icons actually did help make the page more readable. All right, so advice. Who doesn't want advice, right? A lot of the world says, you know, I don't know what to do with this money. Give me some help. Tell me where to invest it. Probably everybody on this webinar knows that there are a lot of restrictions in terms of what you can and can't do in terms of giving advice, right? However, I bet if you did a poll of pretty much every retirement investor out there, they probably have no idea about these restrictions. And what ends up happening, because you're not allowed to give advice, or you need to have them, you know, read and sign the T's and C's before, you know, you're able to give them any advice. But so you hold back on giving the advice. Well, the users don't know why that is. So, you know, there was a sense of frustration that, you know, hey, I clicked your advice tool and I'm not really getting anything out of it. You know, this is an area where if you put in some language about why you are perhaps being vague about recommending specific funds, if you let users know that, hey, there's a reason why, and then again, depending on your tolerance for, you know, the risks associated, you know, giving them another way to get that advice, that could alleviate some of that frustration. But just know that users getting to this and seeing that, you know, there's not advice or there's vague advice, the assumption will be that it is the plan provider who is just not giving the advice.
And once they're given that advice, they did expect it to be like extremely easy to follow. There were some instances though when it was a bit difficult. So the use of light boxes and excessive amounts of scrolling often made it a bit difficult to both see the advice and also have the fund selection form in front of you, so where they're actually making those changes to their elections. So an example we have here, I'll use the pointer for this, there's a lot going on here, but up here at the very top of the page where I have one labeled, and you'll see this is a zoomed in version of it, there is a small link called Current Risk Strategy. Now, this is the advice tool. When you open it, it looks like this. And the link's a bit small and difficult to find, and the language that the link uses here, it doesn't really tell respondents that what they're looking at is advice. To most, they assumed it was what their current investments are, since it's called Current Risk Strategy. But that being said, it opens a lightbox, and the lightbox opens about up here, and all the changes that they need to make happen down here. So respondents found themselves opening this lightbox, picking a certain fund category and a certain percentage point that the advice is recommending, then needing to memorize both of those, scroll down to the bottom, enter that in, and then go back up to the top and repeat that maybe 4 or 5, maybe even 6 times, depending on what the tool was recommending to them. This was definitely frustrating for some. A few even got to the point where they said they would screenshot it on the computer, take photos, write it down on paper so that they could have a version of it in front of them while they were just down here on this part of the page by themselves. This did come up in other websites as well, but this is the example that was easiest to show here. And it really shows how important it is to make sure that they can kind of toggle back and forth between or see side by side the advice and where they're actually making their own changes.
So I think takeaway is if people have to take a photo of your website with their phone in order to refer back to it and other things, there's probably some room for improvement. All right, let's talk a little bit about the information architecture. Oh, sorry, this is you, MJ.
No worries. All right. Yeah, so there was some issues in expectation that when respondents went into a portion of the site called Manage Investments, they expected all of the options available after that point to be actual actionable things that they could do to make changes. So, for example, in the Voya financial example that we have on the left here, several respondents clicked Manage Investments, and it brought them to here. And at this point, the first thing they see is investment elections, and their thoughts are, oh, I'm already in the Manage Investments part of the site. That means if I click Investment Elections, I should be able to manage my investment elections. But that was not really the case. From this part, they were brought to a part of the site that was kind of a dead end and really only displayed their current investment elections. They weren't able to, from there, click to edit or make changes. So they had to backtrack, and then they came back to the example screen we're showing here, and they saw the green section that I've highlighted. Oh, change elections. That's where I was meant to be the entire time. So making it a big distinguishing point between just viewing certain things about your account and changing certain things about your account is pertinent. And then also, we found that showing fewer options at a time was much more easy for respondents to feel confident and have an idea of that they were headed in the correct direction. So again, on Voya, we have an example that had 6 different options, and respondents did get where they wanted to eventually, but it was a bit of a guessing game at some point. But then with Principal, they showed 2 options at a time, but in several steps. Respondents got to where they wanted to get quicker, and they had more confidence that they were headed in the right direction here. But it's important to realize there is a bit of a trade-off here. Showing a few steps, a few options at a time, it may be easier, but there is a chance that if they make an incorrect choice earlier on, that they may be led down like the incorrect pathway.
Another thing that we saw was just discoverability issues of key items. So, for example, bring up my laser pointer here again. So for example, on, the CUNA, you come to this page, the visual flow, your investments, and you look down at your categories. But what that's going to do is it actually is going to make it difficult to find if you would want to change your investments. The laser pointer doesn't work nicely with the slide advance, so I'll just go ahead and forego the pointer. Your change investments button is here, and users tend to miss that again because the page is drawing them downward. So, the call to action that they want to take would probably be better suited down here so that it's following the visual flow. Again, we saw a similar thing, with John Hancock. They had an advice tool, again, everybody wants advice. They want some help in deciding where to invest, but you've got all of these bold elements. You've got these pie charts, that tiny little link up there for them to get that the advice. It was largely overlooked. So important to think about, what are the bold visual elements and what are they stealing attention away from on a page? And also, is there a natural visual flow where the page is drawing you in one direction or another? Are your calls to action appropriately placed? Continuing that theme, this was a really interesting finding where there were options or information that were important, but by the time the user got to them in a long scroll situation, their chance had gone, right? It was too late. So for example, here on the left with principal, there was a color-coded key for the different asset classes, but you didn't know what they were. So you're going through, you're trying to figure out what things might be, you're working your way down. By the time you get to that key at the bottom, well, you've already done all the work. Even worse, on the John Hancock one, there were two options. You could put in your employee contribution that could be different from your employer contribution. But by the time you get to this call to action all the way at the bottom to allow you to make them match, you've already gone through and probably manually filled in on both sides. So, and there's no real reason to expect that you would find that down at the bottom. So again, if somebody's going to scroll and there's information that they're going to need up top, make sure that information is available before they start that long scrolling process. And while we're on the color coding thing, Madeline and I actually argued over who was going to get to present this one because it's such an interesting finding. The use of color coding, while it was attractive, was very much hurt by the fact that the colors were a little too close to each other on the color wheel. There was not enough contrast. And in fact, on some monitors, your laptop, depending on the angle of the screen, you may miss the distinction between that blue and that green entirely. I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole on this because it's not something that we tested for, but it's also worth keeping in mind that use of color as a conveyor of information on a website or an app is not Americans with Disabilities Act friendly. People who are colorblind would not be able to see the distinction between those categories. So you may find that if that is the method that you're using, that you may be alienating users with a visual impairment. All right, time for another quiz, opening that up for you. Real easy, are you confident that your site is ADA compliant? That's Americans with Disabilities Act. Got the quiz open there, yes, no, or I don't know. And, if this is something that you've never really thought about, I strongly encourage you to start thinking about it, not just because it's the right thing to do. The internet is pretty mature in 2019. The growing pains are over. It's time to make sure that your site is inclusive. Certainly, you don't want to be losing customers. But also, if you're following the news with that lawsuit with Domino's Pizza, going, I believe, to the Supreme Court at this point about whether or not, basically, they were sued because their digital platform was not accessible. So definitely something you want to start thinking about more as we get into the early part of the 21st century. We're seeing a mix of yes and no. I'm glad to see not a whole lot of people need to Google it. So whether you are or not accessible, I think at least if if you're pretty good or that there are changes you need to make, that's important. So I'll go ahead and close the poll. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time. All right, so now it's time for the pitch, and then we will get into the Q&A, which is always the fun and exciting thing. And I'm not a salesperson, so my pitch will be very brief, so please stick around for the Q&A. Hey, listen, Corporate Insight UX team, this is what we do. We can do this for you. We can do user experience research for your existing site. We can do it for your designs in process. We can compare you against your competitors. We can compare your designs in process against your competitors. One of the advantages of working with the Corporate Insight team is we've got some industry-leading experts in the retirement plan space. The folks who work on our monitor services, they were involved in this research. We could get them involved in your research as well. So if you are interested, if you have a need for user experience research, just reach out to me. As is probably obvious by now, I could talk about this stuff all day, so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So without any further ado, we will jump into the Q&A. There is a Q&A feature on the WebEx. Go ahead and type in a question. That'll come straight to me and Madeline. There's always some people who use the chat as well. If you do that, it will come to us, but we do recommend you use the Q&A just because it comes in a slightly nicer format. I can see some people are typing. I'll give you a second to get your questions in there. All right, a couple questions coming in. I knew I was going to get this question, and to the three people who asked it, it's not because it was a bad or predictable question. It's the question I get everywhere all the time. And that is 7 respondents really enough for accurate results? How did you choose your sample size? Are you confident using 7 respondents? Sample size is a big question. It's one of those tricky things. This was qualitative research. We were not doing opinion polling. We were not, we were not cross-tabbing this information against other behaviors. This was qualitative. This was to understand strengths and weaknesses in designs in order to find out, broad-based views. Now, a lot of what we heard has a good amount of agreement with other user tests that we've done before, maybe in a different medium, but for similar reasons. So, I'm actually pretty confident in what we learned. By the way, the way we arrived at 7 respondents, we had 4 sites that we wanted to show. We wanted to be able to alternate the order that we showed them in. A lot of times we'll do 6. 6 is a really good number, but we wanted to make sure that we had that one additional just to make sure that we were able to rotate them through. For qualitative research, 7 is actually a pretty comfortable sample size. Let's see. Is there one big thing you'd recommend based on these insights? What might that be? Let me think. I'll give an answer, and Madeline, if you have a different answer, you can jump in after me. I would say the big thing would, from my perspective, would be to remember that your plan participants are not financial services people. They're probably very intimidated by things related to financial services. They're probably seeking some guidance. And when I say guidance, I don't even just mean like, here's which funds or here's the myths that you should be going for, but they want their hands held a little bit. They want to know that, what they're doing is okay. They want things explained to them in language that they can understand, but that is not condescending. So I would recommend, taking a step back. Obviously, I'm going to recommend some user research, but even if you can't do formal user research, talk to some users, get a sense of what level they tend to be at in terms of their understanding of financial concepts, the type of language that they use, and make a site that's going to talk to them, because they're going to have very, very different needs than the plan sponsors, than financial advisors, and definitely very different from the folks who work at the retirement plan websites.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And to add on, we actually screened so that the respondents, they told us in advance that they actually make selections of their own funds for their retirement plan. And even with that set of people, they still wanted that hand-holding that you're talking about.
That's a great point. Let's see. What are the most common types of actions financial clients perform on their site? That's a good question. That's actually something that would need to be answered with more of a quantitative. I know that for the Retirement Plan Monitor, that they do some survey work. I don't actually have that on hand. But if you want to reach out to your account rep and ask them that, we may be able to get that information for you. Let's see. How do you see UX leading change in experiences versus staying with standard language and jargon?
Well, one thing that we learned actually is that, at least in the 4 sites that we looked at, there was really no standard language used across the 4 sites for these different transaction names. And that's a part of why users were confused.
Yeah, I spent a little time when we were analyzing the results, talking with Olivia Jack, who is probably some of you know the name from her writings in this space. She's one of our analysts here at Corporate Insight. And, we were talking about standardized language. And, it's one of those kind of wiggly things where there are some sort of standard terms that are used in the industry. But again, that doesn't necessarily equate to how people talk about things. It goes beyond the scope of what we did here. I do think there's an opportunity for folks in this space to try out different methods, to look at, maybe less of a menu of options and more of an action-oriented, what do you want to do today? What are you looking at? Are you looking at the future? Are you looking at the money that you already have invested? What kinds of changes are you making? And to try and build something that way. If I were to look into a crystal ball, just with more things taking a more conversational interface as personal assistants and things like that, maybe that more back and forth conversational style might resonate. Again, it's a guess, but that's the kind of thing that I think it is worth for a forward-looking company to say, hey, let's try this out. Let's mock something up. Let's put it in front of users, and see what we can learn from it, which coincidentally is the sort of thing that we at Corporate Insight may be able to help you with. So one of the things I really love about user testing in a lab environment is you have the opportunity to try stuff out without it being on your actual live authenticated website. You can make mistakes without alienating customers or having people accidentally allocating their funds differently. So, I always recommend people try things out in a lab environment, see what they can learn. Let's see, next question. Did you test mobile? In this case, we did not. Would have really required a much more in-depth test. But also, as we thought about this, did not seem like the sort of thing that people would necessarily want to do on mobile. We hear in a lot of user tests that for large, important things like this, people want a big screen where they can focus, where they can have other applications open, where they're able to see more. So we felt that desktop was the form factor to go with. Let's see. This is a good one. Why did you only look at 4 websites, and how were they selected? Really it boiled down to we wanted a good cross-section, and the 4 that we chose, by the way, not necessarily the 4 best. It's not like we were doing a bake-off of here are the 4 best, let's see which rises to the top. We chose 4 that had very different approaches so that we could have people reacting to them in context of each other. The way they were selected, our retirement plan monitor team looked at the sites under measurement and chose some that handled things in very different ways in order to get that kind of feedback. Let's see. What have you seen as big issues when it relates to retirement income planning tools? I'm not sure that we looked at any planning tools for this test. I would need to get back to you. So you know what? That is a good question, and it's possible that we've got some good data on this. I'm going to ask you to reach out to your account rep on that one, and they'll potentially be able to get you some information on what we have. But yeah, that one unfortunately was outside of the scope of this test. Let's see, questions still coming in. It is not too late if you want to add some in there. The next one, if plan participants don't understand industry terms, how are we supposed to have any labels at all? Okay, yeah, we talked about that one a little bit. I hope I answered your question. Again, plain English, maybe something more conversational. But yeah, I think step outside of the language that you guys use internally and start to maybe build a lexicon of the language of your customers. And the best way to do that is to talk to them and see how they talk about things. All right, let's see. You mentioned the importance of a confirmation screen. What are the important elements of a confirmation screen? That's a good question. Ideally, it would summarize, and by the way, when I answer this question, I'm drawing from a lot of past research that we've done that involved confirmation screens. You want to show what's the information that was added, that was changed, a concise, succinct explanation of what was done. And very important, you want to have the ability to make changes. If somebody gets to that confirmation screen and they see, oh, you know what, I put this at 26%, I meant to do it at 36% or whatever, giving them the option to make that change from that screen. You sometimes see, a confirmation screen where it's like your options are okay or cancel. What does cancel do? Does that mean they've lost all the work that they've been spending the time working on? Giving them a call to action to make corrections if they find something that's wrong. And then conversely, don't have superfluous information. to paraphrase an old Jacob Nielsen line, if you give people too much information, you train them to ignore what's important. All right, let's see, what else do we have? We got a few repeats here, so bear with us as we look through the questions coming in. Did you have respondents do any other transactions? I only saw screenshots for future investment management. Yeah,
we really wanted to have respondents have it be pretty straightforward and simple across just for our own analysis and synthesis. So we had them only do make changes to their future investments. That way, when we would compare and contrast all the differences between the sites and also the respondents' interactions with the sites, it was on the same playing field.
Great. Let's see, can you talk a little more about the difference between fewer or more options per page? Okay, yeah, that was a slide where, the one version that had 6 options and the other version that had 2. This is, and bear with me because I'm going to get geeky with you on the information architecture, but this is basically when we start talking about what they call a narrow and deep structure versus a wide and shallow, right? So do you hit people with a bunch of options up front so that they're closer to, maybe they only have to make 2 choices before they get to their desired outcome? Or do you give them just a couple options so they don't have as much to have to dig through, but it takes them more, they have to make more selections before they get to what they want? There's pros and cons to each. There's no one size fits all. The pros of that wide and shallow is they got a bunch of options laid out so they can look at the different options in context of each other. And if there's not a lot of potential overlap between them, maybe they can choose the one thing they want. And then on the next, selection, they're right there. Whereas, when you just start out with 2 choices, they have to make a bunch of selections. But, at the same time, if there is potential overlap, having all of those options up front, the more options you have, the more potential overlap there could be, right? If you've got that narrow and deep, maybe they only have to make 2 choices up front. If you only have 2 things, more likely you're going to have less overlap, so they're going to less likely choose the wrong one. But if they do choose that wrong one, they may go all the way down the rabbit hole before they realize, I didn't get what I want. I don't know if what I want exists. So I would say an exercise in choosing which way to do, I would look at what are the number of options that you have, how could you bucket them in a way that is going to minimize the potential overlap between categories, and see how it shapes up. A great primer, by the way, the industry standard book on this is Information Architecture for the World Wide Web by Peter Morville. Recommend if you're looking at a project like this, if you're thinking about something like this and you're not sure where to go, I would definitely recommend reading that book. Again, that's Information Architecture for the World Wide Web by Peter Morville. Or if you just Google, who's the information architecture guy, Peter Morville will probably come up because he's the godfather of that space. Let's see. Oh, this is a great question. What and how do you balance between user feedback and designer intuition? Hey, listen, the 2 go hand in hand. If you are an experienced designer, you've learned some things over the years, you've got some great ideas. That said, I strongly recommend that those 2 actually go hand in hand, that you come to the table with your best ideas and then you put it in front of users. If they don't get it, you're going to run into trouble. Now, here's the thing. That's not to say if you have a great idea and you user test it and it doesn't test well, you just throw it away, right? Because it has happened many times in the industry of our digital world that people have had good ideas that users didn't get at first, and in time it became the next big thing. What happens is when a user test does not go well, when users struggle with it, that's a good opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, why? Why were users struggling with this? Is it just a bad idea? Is there something about the execution? Is there something needed in terms of selling the opportunity or educating the user? Educating the user is always such a tricky thing because we expect things to be intuitive, but sometimes you can teach without them knowing you're teaching. So I would say you definitely want to respect the, I don't know if intuition is the right word, but the experience of a designer. You want to give designers the opportunity to really build based on their actual learnings and their ability as a designer, but at the same time, you always want to make sure that you're going to get that user testing in there because, as they say, it's a lot cheaper to fail on the drawing board than on the construction site with a sledgehammer. So I would say the two should live hand in hand, but yeah, that's a great question. Let's see, we got time for maybe one more. Let's see. You said something about the use of color needing to be ADA compliant. Is there anything else like that we need to be considering? Hey, listen, ADA compliance, accessibility, could potentially be its own whole webinar. And unfortunately, that's not one that I am qualified to give. What I would recommend is if there is not somebody in your organization who is either an expert or willing to become an expert in accessibility, maybe that's something that you ought to think about either hiring or finding a firm that does have that specialty and that knowledge. It is something that is going to become increasingly important. If you are a smaller company where you really just do not have the resources to have that degree of specialization, there is a lot of information that's out there. I would recommend making sure that your team is aware of it. The good news is if you Google it, there are a lot of very authoritative sources out there. The W3 Consortium is one of them, and there's been a lot written about it. It's very easy to educate yourself on this, so I would say it's definitely something that you want to look into, you want to study up on, and have some in-house knowledge about that. All right, it looks like we're coming up on the hour here. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. This was a fun study to do. It was definitely a fun one to present. Thank you for the good Q&A. If you have additional questions, again, I encourage you to reach out to your account rep. If you're not currently a client and you don't have an account rep, you can reach out to me or Madeline, and we'll get you in the right direction to get your questions answered. So yeah, definitely. Again, as you probably guessed, I am happy to talk about this stuff all day. So please feel free to reach out if you did not get your question answered. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a lot of fun. We'll see you next time on the next UX Spotlight.